In this session, I'd like to speak a little bit about Psalm 45. Now, Psalm 45 is a royal psalm. It's something that was applied to the king of Israel, but then later on would be applied to Jesus. In fact, Psalm 45 speaks about a wedding feast. The king of Israel, the northern kingdom, is getting married, and they called in the poet laureate. You see, in those days, they didn't have videographers to be able to film what the wedding was about. They would have a poet laureate who would describe, first of all, the groom, then the bride, then the wedding. We hear, "My heart overflows with a goodly theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is like the pen of a ready scribe." So the scribe himself is saying, I'm going to do a good job because I'm a talented author. You are the fairest of the sons of men. He's being paid by the word, and he's being paid by the groom, the king. Therefore, he's going to say very nice things about the king. So you're handsome, grace is poured upon your lips, you're eloquent, God has blessed you forever, gird your sword upon your thigh, you're a great warrior. You're going to ride forth for the cause of truth and to defend the right, that you're going to practice justice and defend justice. Now, the only problem with this is that the king who was getting married didn't do any of this. The king getting married was Ahab, and the woman that he was married has a famous name, Jezebel. Ahab was the king of the northern kingdom, and this was a divided kingdom. You had a Jewish village, and right next door was a pagan village. And the pagans worshiped the god Baal, while the Jews worshiped Yahweh. Now the Syrians to the north worshiped Baal, and there was always the danger that they would invade. So how could the king of Israel be sure that his pagan subjects would remain faithful? He would marry a pagan wife. And in fact, he married a woman who came from what today is Lebanon. Her father was a king, but also a priest of Baal. Her name was Jezebel. And we know that this is the wedding that's being talked about because the poet specifically refers to the ivory palace. Ahab's father Omri built the ivory palace. It was destroyed after the reign of Ahab. So it was only built for a very short period. This has to refer to Ahab's marriage to Jezebel. And in fact, later on, they'll talk about the princesses and the leading women of Tyre bringing gifts for this wedding. That's, again, in Lebanon. Your divine throne endures forever. Now, that's probably a mistranslation. The king doesn't have a divine throne. He has a godly throne, a throne that's blessed by God, and it'll endure forever. Now, that was an important promise to the king of Israel, the north, because in the north, they didn't have a stable dynasty like they did in the south. In the south, from the days of King David all the way to the time of the Babylonian exile, you had one dynasty. In the north, you would have a powerful general take over. He would reign for a while. His son would take over, and within a few years, he'd be overthrown by a general, and you'd start a new dynasty. It was like a banana republic. There was no consistency. So to promise the king that his throne would endure forever, he's promising him a dynasty. Our God has anointed you with the oil of gladness. The oil of gladness would simply be the oil that was used to anoint the king when he was enthroned. Notice I didn't say when he received his crown, because in the ancient world, crowns were not quite as important as the idea of sitting on a throne. Your robes are fragrant with myrrh and aloes and cassia. Now, there was a reason why they would rub these spices on the raiment of the king. This was a wedding feast. You had hundreds of people gathered in a relatively closed space. And these people had bathed once every 6 months, whether they needed it or not. And in the ancient world, they believed bad odors could bring disease. In fact, we still have a disease that originally was based on the idea that bad odors caused this disease. It's called malaria. Malaria comes from two Italian words, mal, aria, the bad air. So in times of plague, people would carry around posies, little dried flowers that they'd sniff to not have to sniff the bad odors. Likewise, the king's robes are rubbed with these spices. Ivory palaces, stringed instruments make you glad. Daughters of kings are among your ladies of honor. At your right hand stands the queen in gold of Ophir. Now, the woman who's sitting next to him at his right hand is not the woman he's getting married to, Jezebel. In ancient times, the kings had many wives, and therefore in Israel and Judah, the queen was not the wife of the king, it was his mother. The queen mother's role was to prepare the wedding feast for her son. And so when we refer to the queen sitting at the right of the king in gold of Ophir, very precious gold, this is the queen mother. And then it talks about the woman he's marrying, Jezebel. She's supposed to forget her father's ways. Remember, her father was a pagan priest. She's supposed to forget all that. This is one piece of advice she does not follow in any way. Remember how she persecuted the priests of Yahweh. Remember how she tried to get Elijah killed. That she promoted the cult of Baal in the land. And so this is a very sad poem because it's about a terrible wedding and a terrible disaster that overtook Israel. And yet, God can turn it around and have it applied to Jesus. In fact, the Gospel of John takes 3 passages from this psalm and applies them to Jesus. First of all, the queen is at your right in gold of Ophir, the queen mother. Remember the wedding feast of Cana? What is Mary's role? She prepares the wedding feast for her son. They have no wine. She's the queen mother. Second, the king's enemies fall at his feet and lose heart. Remember when Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, "Who do you seek?" They say, "Jesus of Nazareth." He says, "I am." They fall at his feet twice. And then third, what do they bury Jesus with? With myrrh and aloes, just as we heard the raiment of the king anointed with those spices. Jesus marries the church on the cross. He is the King of Kings, but a king who rules not from a throne, but from the cross. So notice how God can turn even something horrific like this poem, like the cross, into a blessing. Doesn't that give us perspective on the difficult times in our life? Sometimes the greatest trust we ever learned, the greatest love that we ever experienced, comes in the midst of those difficulties. God can turn them around, transform them, if we trust in God's love. In this psalm, when should we pray a psalm for the wedding feast of the Lamb? Every time we go to Mass. Because in a sense, when we receive that Eucharist, the flesh of Jesus is joining our flesh. When is it that 2 flesh become one? In marriage. In a sense, we're marrying our God. And so we should celebrate that marriage. We should celebrate the fact that Ahab messed up, but Jesus never messes up.